I'm a really big fan of lots of your work, and one reason is because I feel like you are just so good at communicating about scientific ideas and findings and broadening the conversation more globally. And it seems really important that we all scientists and science-minded people get better at that because there are all of these new scientific things that are going to change our world in very big ways. My field, synthetic biology, but in artificial intelligence, and I can imagine augmented sensation, and all these other fields, like global warming sciences, where people understanding and feeling comfortable engaging in the conversation is like going to be really valuable for us to be able to have a rational and effective discussion as a society. So how can we all get better at communicating about science, and how can we as a society move towards having more rational conversations about developments in science and all that?
Great, thanks for the question. It's such a great and important question. I would say a couple things. One is, I don't know if you went to graduate school. Did you go to grad school? Okay. Grad school really beats it out of you, this idea of science communication. When I started grad school, I would write things in a way that I write them currently, and my mentors and people beat that out of me. They said, that's not how you write a scientific paper. Instead, it gets all, what you want it to be is all jargony, and anyway, it's a bunch of bullshit that I had to then unlearn when I got out of grad school. So one thing is, in teaching undergrads and grad students, I think it's critical to teach them what you want is clarity. What you want is a way to say it in a way that everyone understands, but unfortunately a lot of undergrads and grad students are taught the more confusing you make it sound, the more people will be impressed and think you're really smart. So if we get that part straight, that would help a lot. Happily, there are so many channels and venues for science communication now in a way that there never were before. When Carl Sagan did his show Cosmos on PBS, that was, at least to my knowledge, one of really the first times that someone had done something like that. It was so beautiful. But now you go on YouTube, 1 billion people are doing that. It's wonderful. Everyone's doing, whatever their field is. They're making little videos about it. What I've noticed is some of them are higher quality science than others. Sometimes people get things a little bit wrong, but at least there's a big effort to have the conversation scientifically. I think it's really wonderful. And again, one of the reasons why this next generation is just going to be a lot better off than we are, because they can access that stuff all the time. Thanks so much for the question. Yeah.
I have a question about bandwidth and like the speed at which we can interconnect with other people, the speed at which we can information can come in, and how fast the information can go out. It seems like your product would be like an iterative step towards even higher bandwidths. Where do you feel like your technology, specifically the haptic, like sonic input transducer, where do you think that fits in that curve, that exponential curve?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Two things to say about that. One is when it comes to things like AR, as people think of it with a headset, that is using what I think of as the software of the brain. Like, you're using the brain software to read the graph or do whatever it is. So what I think is cool about this is it's plugging right into the hardware, which is say it becomes part of your perception, of your direct feeling. So I call this AR. It's just a different sort of thing. But in answer to your question, one thing that I've been very interested in trying, we haven't done this yet, but if you want to do this with your spouse, where you feel each other's physiologic signals. So you feel, the heartbeat, the galvanic skin response, blood pressure, and so on, all that you're feeling about your spouse as he or she is walking around, and you guys are across the nation from one another, and you are plugged into this other person in a deeper way. And then you can, you're on the other side of the nation, you call up and you say, hey honey, are you feeling okay? You feel a little stressed out, because I can tell something's going on. So I think it's a really cool idea. Someone recently suggested, hey, why don't we do that at work where everyone can feel each other work? I think that's a terrible idea, actually, because...
You wasn't asking about AR, though.
I'm addressing the question about how you get a higher bandwidth in understanding other people, for example. Gotcha. So, but at work you probably wouldn't want it, because Bob gets up to give a PowerPoint presentation, and Bob's really stressed, but he's trying to act like he's not stressed. A big part of language is about deception, actually. And so, anyway, you probably wouldn't want to know who's. Anyway. But I think there are all kinds of interesting experiments to try, which we'll try over the next 3 years, 5 years, with this kind of thing about how can we really increase our bandwidth. And I mentioned before that the communication channel between people relies on language, and that's such low bandwidth. I mean, the analogy that I've started to use is, you remember The Martian, Andy Weir's book, the Matt Damon movie, where he's stuck on a planet all by himself? That's essentially what I think it is. We're all on our own planet. We're all the sole inhabitant of our own planet, and we just have this little radio channel between us to try to explain things.
But
so,
that wasn't nearly as good as Interstellar, right?
Let me come back to Interstellar in a minute. Okay. So anyway, this is an answer to the question of how we might increase that bandwidth between people. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, thanks. 2 questions. One, given that our brains are plastic, but yet we have limited capacity to tap into our plasticity, what do you think the future holds for either cosmetic neurology or neuromodulation techniques? And then also, being a neuroscientist, what's your explanation for the binding problem?
Yeah, great questions. I'll answer them in reverse order. So the binding problem is, I mentioned that you're getting information through your touch, through your vision, through your hearing, through your smell. And somehow we have a unified perception. When you watch a blue bird flying to the left in front of you, you don't see the blue coming off the bird and the motion and the sound. And it all seems like one thing. And yet it's so weird because these are all coming in through different channels. So that's what the binding problem is. We don't know what the answer is. One speculation has been that it has to do with the timing of the cells firing when you have a synchrony of cells across different brain areas, the visual cortex and auditory cortex and so on. And that may be right, but ask me again in 10 years and we'll see how that data is coming along. As far as the neuroplasticity thing goes, I think there's a big unanswered question there, which is just a weird one, which is, brains start off as very plastic, which means they absorb information, they change accordingly, and that's why a baby born in this country comes to speak English and, recognize the American flag and whatever, but, it absorbs everything about our culture and all the science that's come up to blah, blah, blah. As you grow older, the plasticity becomes less and less, so it's harder to learn a language at our age, and so on.
Cool things like cognition peaks at 23, and then it just goes down over time.
Well, that's not necessarily the case. That's often, Nobel Prizes in physics usually happen at that age, but that's for a different reason, which I can come back to. But the issue is that plasticity diminishes. It doesn't go away. You can still, like I said, if you learn how to juggle, I can see changes in your brain even as an adult and so on, but it diminishes. The key is this, though. You actually want that. You wouldn't want it any other way because you become who you are because of that. So if we went in and gave you cosmetic neurosurgery to make you super plastic again, who you are and who all your friends know you as and so on, all that goes away. All the memories that you've stored in there and this where I grew up and blah, blah, blah. Maybe there's certain things you want to forget, but you would forget everything. If we made you totally plastic again, you wouldn't remember how to speak English. You wouldn't remember how to walk. You'd have to do that again, learn that again, and so on. So anyway, that's the interesting paradox about plasticity that I'm chewing on lately is that, you sort of, there's an expression, I can't remember who said this, so sorry, but somebody said, every man is born as 1,000 men and dies as a single man, which I find such a fascinating statement, which is to say you've got so much potential when you're born and you die as a single person. Yeah. But again, I think it would be, well, I agree, it would be hard to have it any other way, I think.
Hey, David, thank you for your creative thinking.
Thank you.
You're probably aware, maybe not, that there is an increasingly popular movement in the Bay Area to microdose with LSD.
I am aware, yeah.
Okay, as a way of increasing...
Ow, ow!
Yoo-hoo! As a way of increasing creativity and awareness. So what's your thoughts on that and or experience?
So I read an early version of Ayelet Waldman's new book called A Really Good Day. And it was about microdosing. So she microdosed for 30 days, and she's always, as she writes about publicly in the book, I'm not revealing it, she's always had problems with depression and sometimes mania and, just dealing with her emotions and so on. So her experience over these 30 days was having a much more stabilized sort of emotional life. And she said her husband, who happens to be my cousin, noticed it, and their family noticed it. So anyway, I find it super interesting. When I blurbed her book, I'll just say that I made sure that as a neuroscientist blurbing the book, I said a very general thing like, this just points us to the fact that we have so much more to understand. And the reason I was cautious about the statement is because it's hard to know if she has a really great 30 days, is it a placebo effect? Is it because she thinks, hey, there's this really great new thing and it's going to solve this? It's really hard to know. So I'm totally optimistic about doing the science experiment, which is running as an experiment. But ask me again in a year.
I'll volunteer.
Great. I'm not providing the LSD, but there's no shortage of it in the Bay Area as far as I can tell. And so yeah, good. I mean, I think microdosing, the thing is, there are all these psychoactive drugs that have been illegal to try things that are therapeutic. And so most of them probably won't yield anything therapeutic, but it's great that we'll try them. I think that's, obviously it's the only way to discover anything new. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Hi, I have two questions. So artificial intelligence is a buzzword these days, and so when you read media stories about artificial intelligence, so how reporters describe it as, AI is this technology that is loosely based on brain. So I work at a company where, so we have research scientists who develop very leading edge AI, and they don't like this kind of description. So you touched this in your talk a little bit. So do you think if we bring together computer scientists, especially machine learning scientists, and neuroscientists together, and work on AI together, will this actually help advance this field to the next level? So my next question, so being someone who, like you, who understands how your brain works so well, I wonder if that changes your behaviors. For example, I was listening to your talk and I have experience I'm sure a lot of people in this room can relate to. I just can't help myself thinking about or checking my phones every now and then. So I wonder for someone like you, if maybe when something like that happens to you, maybe you think, oh, this is something my brain doing a trick, I'm not gonna do that. So do you have any examples, like how your understanding of brain changed your behaviors?
Yeah, I can address that very directly. In fact, this is gonna be my next book, which is, it's already mostly done. It's called the Ulysses Contract, because I've spoken on this several times, which is...
That's how you started working out.
What's that?
That's how you work out. You work out with it.
Yeah, that's how I work out. That's exactly right. But what the Ulysses Contract is about is, if you remember the myth of Ulysses, Odysseus, who was coming home from the Trojan War, and he realized he was going to pass the island of the Sirens, and the Sirens were these mythical creatures who would sing songs so beautiful that the sailors would get entranced and then they'd crash into the rocks and die. But Ulysses really wanted to hear the siren song, but he didn't want to crash and die. So you may remember what he did. He filled his men's ears with beeswax, and he had them lash him to the mast so that he couldn't do anything. And he said, no matter what I do, no matter what I'm screaming and so on, just keep rowing past the island. And that way he was able to hear the siren song. He went nuts. He told them, go to the island. But of course they just kept rowing, and then they were safe. But the point is, this is what has come to be called a Ulysses contract, because what happened was the Ulysses of sound mind, way before they got to the island, knew that he would behave badly when he heard the siren song. So he made a contract that was unbreakable, where the contract was, okay, I'm going to tie myself to the mast so that I can't behave badly when I get into that situation. So I'm very enamored by this idea of the Ulysses contract, and we're surrounded with these all the time. So I think in answer to your question, I've gotten really good at Ulysses contracts because I understand that there's parts of my brain that really care about the short term, like eating the chocolate cake, and part of my brain that care about who I want to be in the long term. And it's easy, of course, to think about who we want to be, but it's very difficult when we're facing temptation. And so the whole trick is, how do you structure things so you don't face temptation? Just an example is, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, the very first thing they tell you is clear all the alcohol out of your house. Because on a festive Saturday night or a lonely Sunday night, you're going to end up drinking it if it's there in the house, so just get rid of it all. If you're in a drug rehab program, the first lesson is don't carry more than $20 of cash with you because someone's going to offer you drugs, and if you've got the cash, it's burning a hole in your pocket, you'll buy it. So what you do is you establish some behavior at the beginning such that when you face the temptation, you don't deal with it. I was speaking on a college campus a little while ago, and I found out that what the students do there is they are worried about logging into Facebook during finals week when they're supposed to be studying. So they switch Facebook passwords with each other and change the password so they can't log in.
Yep.
And it's a very clever thing because they know they're going to be tempted, and so they take care of that first. And then when finals are over, they give the Facebook passwords back. So anyway, there's lots of examples of this, and that's the way that, as a neuroscientist, I've really come to understand that I have lots of votes in my head. Many votes are voting for the stupid things, and a couple votes are voting for the smart things, and so I try to structure things so I can't not listen to the smart ones. As far as your question...
Conscientiousness is a huge indicator of intelligence as well, your ability to set contracts with yourself and execute on those. Some long-term thinking.
Well, thank you. The other question you asked about, should brain scientists get together with artificial intelligence researchers? Yes, and that people have tried that a lot. The problem is the AI researchers are sort of looking for a hit, like, hey, if we do this, we can distinguish pictures of dogs from cats or whatever. And so the general story tends to be the neuroscientists come in and say, wow, look, we don't understand X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And the AI researchers come to understand one thing and they say, okay, great, we're going to go start a business now. See you guys later. So I wish there were a structure that they could stay together longer because I think it would be very fruitful. Hi. Yeah, hold on to your question.
Hold on to the
Hi.
question.
Okay.
I'll get you.
So, David, let me put it this way. I'm trying to find the secret of happiness, right? The spiritual practices, whatever I've gotten information from, right? They all kind of get into the same advice of being in the present, right? Like being in the present moment. This kind of touch, I mean, simply put, what I'm trying to ask is, from a neuroscience perspective, does it make sense when I say we cannot think and feel at the same time? Like, for example, if I feel something, does it force my brain to stop thinking? The background behind this question is, like, all our troubles, right? All our problems come from being in the time, like being in the future, we are scared of it, or thinking about the past, we are worried about it, right? So spiritual practices, what they tell us is, like, when you bring your attention to your body, it is always in the present moment, and you cannot really have your thoughts, like, bother you, right? My question is this: when you feel something, like anything in your body, does it force our brain to, like, stop thinking? That's
so cool question. I can tell you this: 100 years ago, there were big debates about how emotion and thoughts and your body interact with each other. There was essentially two schools of thought. One said, look, you know, when you have a thought that triggers an emotion, that makes your stomach tighten or whatever. And the other school of thought was, when your stomach tightens, that's what gives you the thought that you're anxious about something. And the question was, which was right? And it turns out that all got resolved. It's both. It's this big feedback loop, and it's not clear that you can ever separate and say which thing came first, which is actually related to something Alan brought up an hour ago, which was, you know, where does a thought start? And with any thought you have, there's no T0. There's no time zero that we can point to and say, that's when the thought started. Instead, your entire life of every experience that leads to the next thing and the next thing. So unfortunately, there's no way to say which leads to what. As far as happiness goes, no one said it better than our mutual friend of a number of us named Peter Baumann, who's a good friend of ours, who Peter's expression is, some days are better than others. And what he means by that is that the brain always adapts to whatever is going on. Of course, there have been lots of studies about this. You know, if you win the lottery, you're really happy, but then after a while, you go back to your baseline of happiness. If you get paralyzed in a car accident, you're really sad, but then after a while, you go back to whatever your baseline was. It just becomes the new normal. And so, as a result, we always adjust to whatever our new baseline is, and some days are better and some days are worse. And, you know, yeah. And anyway, this Peter has really done a lot to convince me of this. I think he's totally right that the pursuit of happiness might be impossible because we're just fluctuating around our baselines.
Do we want to go here? Yeah.
Do you want to?
Oh, okay.
You okay? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you said something very interesting earlier. You said that there's nobody walking around the world experiencing, like seeing all the different electromagnetic waves that you could possibly be seeing in the whole spectrum and such. And it reminded me, I have kind of done this. So I took a FLIR 1 camera, which is an infrared camera, connected it to my phone, put my phone in basically a little box, put it at the end of the box, attached the box to my head, and then all I could see was the phone rather than anything around me, and I walked around for a few hours just sort of seeing around and seeing how you experience the world like this. It was really weird and really interesting, but what I remember was just looking at everyday things that you would immediately recognize normally, you know, a chair, people, you know, certain things. I knew what I was looking at, or roughly knew what I was looking at. Some people I couldn't recognize or whatever, but I knew it as a person, for example. But there was this weird sense in which the person didn't, like if you were normally looking at them, your brain would recognize them quickly as a person, etc. In this case, there was a sense that you're experiencing the middle layer, right? Like you're experiencing, like the like salience of them is gone, and instead you're consciously aware of who they are, but you're not ingesting it in the same way. So I'm thinking with the company that you're working on, is it similar where you hear the bark of a dog and you think, okay, that's the bark of a dog, but where you or I would hear a bark of a dog, we wouldn't think that way. We'd just look at the dog and realize it's barking, right? Like a different conscious experience.
Totally.
When does that fade? When does that happen? Like when does that middle layer go away? Like how many days would I have to walk around with that thing strapped to my head for that to happen?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. Probably about 4 or 5 days is what it takes. So at first when you put it on, you're like, oh, it's buzzing, and there's a weird buzzing feeling and so on. You can identify things pretty easily. Like, oh yeah, that felt like a cell phone ringing or a dog barking or whatever it is. But it becomes part of your conscious experience after some days, and depending on the task, you know, because right, if we're feeding electromagnetic radiation in there or whatever, it's some things probably take longer and shorter depending on the task. But that's the weird part, is that for all of our senses, we have this transition. Of course, we don't remember it. One of the chapters I'm writing in my book Livewire is this issue about when you're holding an infant and it looks you right in the eyes, you think, oh, how wonderful it's looking at me in the eyes. I think the infant is not experiencing looking at you in the eyes at all. Like, it's completely a different reality to the infant, because all it's getting is this barrage of spikes, and it's figuring out what the heck to do with that and how it correlates to other things and so on. But it eventually becomes a direct perceptual experience, just like we're seeing each other here. But it starts off just like you with the infrared camera. The interesting part would be if you wore it for days and days or for months, let's say that in front of one eye and your other eye is seeing this world, to see how those things merge. And that's essentially what we're going to be trying. That's cool that you got to do that.
So I have a few questions. The first one related to time being slower during an event. Could that also be because you're being present, kind of like what was said before, where you're not thinking about future or past, but you're in that moment?
So let me answer that real quick. Yes, it's when you're in the present, that's when you're laying down memories. Under normal circumstances, your brain is doing 59 things, thinking about your shopping list and what you need to order on Amazon, how you're getting home, and blah, blah, blah. Your brain's thinking about 50 things. When you're falling off a roof, you're thinking one thing. How am I going to land? You know, like what do I do next? And so, so it is that being in the present doesn't actually make you see in slow motion, but it does make you write down everything that's going on.
Okay. As far as the collective hive mind, what are your thoughts on sensing energy, and how does that happen in the brain?
It's a great question. There have been a lot of experiments over the years, since the 50s and 60s and so on, about whether people can pick up on other energy sources. So far that's yielded nothing. So it depends what we mean by energy, but in terms of all the things that we can think of, like electromagnetic radiation or other frequencies in the hearing space or whatever, as romantic an idea as it is, there's not been a single scientific experiment that actually shows that to be true.
But you were mentioning earlier two people having some sort of a collective mindset.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily call that energy, because I think it would be confusing with what we mean, and we've got a whole library of things that we mean by energy. That is, if our brain acts as a mega brain and so on, then that's a really interesting neuroscience question about what happens when you get all these neural networks together acting like one neural network, but I wouldn't call it energy.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is what I mean about the hive mind. It's acting like a mega network, but I just wouldn't import the word energy into it because we mean something very different by energy.
Okay. How does emotional trauma impact plasticity?
Essentially, I mentioned before the amygdala, which is the secondary memory source when you're in an emergency situation. So when people experience trauma, that gets written down, and the shitty part about amygdala memory is it's unerasable. So other kinds of memories can get erased under various circumstances, but amygdala memories don't. So, so the best you can do if you have a trauma is learn strategies to overwrite that, and when you think about it, to immediately switch to thinking about something else and so on. But obviously, as I flagged before, the reason memory exists is to write down when the important stuff happens. And that's why when there's something emotionally traumatic, you really keep a record of that. Terry, remember? Nope. Oh, okay.
Hi, David. You mentioned a story about university students kind of exchanging passwords so that they could use Facebook less. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on these big technology companies such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram that have designed their products to be as addictive as possible? And what are your thoughts on the fact that young children, when they're 2 years old, 3-year-olds, are exposed to these highly habituative products where it's, because I have a 2-year-old cousin at the moment who is currently addicted to YouTube. And this baby knows how to sort of scroll down all these thumbnails and so forth. And you also mentioned the pros of technology, right? We are exposed to all this information, but at the same time, how do we deal with information overload, right? So this question is basically, what are your thoughts on the sort of unintended consequences that are coming from highly addictive technologies? And number two, is this something that we should be concerned about? Or is this sort of a natural thing that we will eventually adapt to as human beings?
Yeah, these are all good questions, and this is sort of the set of questions of our generation, of our era right now, is trying to figure all these out. And people are coming up with different sorts of new ways that we can think about approaches here, and I think there's a growing awareness of it as well, so that people, even in the most addicted places, have an awareness of, hey, you know what, let's on Facebook set up a face-to-face meeting, go out to a coffee, go on a hike, stuff like that. In general, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think that there's a part of it that is not new, as in everybody has always been trying to set up everything to be maximally addictive. So when I walk into a library, which feels like, all right, this is real, this is a library. In fact, every author writing the book tried to make it the best book possible to get my attention, to make me keep reading it and so on. You don't want to write a crappy book that I will put down, right? So everybody's always trying to make it the kind of thing that you'll get stuck to. And Sears tries to offer the best thing, and Continental Airlines tries to do the best thing with the service or the stewardesses and so on. So it's not really anything new there. And then the question that everyone's asking is it in fact, just a different degree of the same thing, which is I think the camp where I fall into, as opposed to a completely new kind of thing. I mean, the reason for arguing it's completely new is, there's data and there's this and that, but the fact is advertisers have always been people who are very clever about that, and they don't need all that data to say, hey, if I'm trying to sell this breakfast cereal, I'll use sexy people who are all laughing and having a good time, and that's really what you need. It's not like you can apply some AI algorithm that's going to come up with something very different than that. So anyway, I think I fall in the camp of it's sort of more of it, but it's not really a brand new problem that we're dealing with. And in the same way that we all grew up with television and newspaper ads and magazine ads and so on that are all trying to get our attention, and billboards and whatever, and we just deal with it. It just becomes part of the background radiation. And in fact, we're quite good at driving down a highway and just sort of ignoring it. Like imagine you came from a world, imagine you landed here from a planet where there were no billboards. You think, oh my God, you're driving down the road. Everywhere you look, there's a sign for a business. You must be distracted, you must get ADHD, blah, blah, blah. But we're quite good at just not paying attention when we don't want to. And I think, when people read the internet, you read something like CNN, it's completely smooshed up with ads, but you know where to look to get the story that you want. So I'm not so worried about it.
All right, last question. Okay, sure. We'll do one last question. Okay.
Hello, thank you for your time. So I come from a complex trauma background. So, and then in the past few years, I've been very committed to trauma healing. And so there are 3 trauma responses, which in my understanding is a fight, flight, freeze. So I have a very long conditioning, which I freeze the trauma. So even the traumatic events that happened like decades ago, when my trauma is triggered, then I freeze and also get dissociated, right? So when it happens, it's like the whole world stop and then time stop, and I cannot even feel a sense of my body. It's like out of my body experience kind of things. But and also there was erased trauma when I started seeing a psychiatrist. She wanted me to describe what exactly happened that would kind of bring the emotions that were not processed, right? And then I couldn't think of the event, so there was a hypnosis, which experience, and then there was a re-traumatizing experience while the memory started coming back, and then, well, I've gone through it, so got to a point where when dissociation and trauma trigger happens to me, I have an awareness, the recognizing it, and then there's something I could do about it. So I've been building some tools, included somatic experiencing and mindfulness meditation. But it takes a very long time. Would there be any, I don't know, it could be the apps or neuroscientific, I don't know, research or in a scientific way that none of us psychotherapy could do that could enhance trauma recovery. That would be hopeful.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sorry for what you've been through. People are making advances in psychotherapy and doing things. They're trying out different sorts of approaches that essentially have to do with having a person be able to concentrate on the future instead of concentrate on the past. So whenever you find yourself looking in the rearview mirror, you figure out these ways to look forward. So people are trying various things, but there's no trick yet in terms of inserting electrodes or doing something to speed that up.
Is the battery down?
Yeah. Oh, maybe it's the battery. Yeah.
Let's see it.
You're all just shout.
It should still be working, but we got a wireless mic. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anyway, I'm sorry to say that this mic doesn't work either, but I'm sorry to say that there aren't sort of neurobiological approaches to that yet. And the reason this stuff is so fundamental.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Test it. No. The reason this stuff is so fundamental is because this is the stuff that's important.
That's back on though.
Because it's again, it's so important for the brain to write down trauma. That's why we get stuck with this stuff. Last question over there. Great. Okay, so the question has to do with there's a debate in the literature about whether we actually. So this is a separate issue about stuff streaming in from the different things. When you have your perception of this is what's happening. Is the brain actually running discretely every, let's say, 100 milliseconds that makes a decision and puts things together? We don't know the answer to this yet. I will say that the evidence in support of that has been undermined. So it still may be true. But just as an example, Just as an example, some colleagues of mine came out with a finding where they said, look, there's the wagon wheel effect in movies. So if you see a movie and there's like a car or a wagon wheel, it looks like it's running backwards sometimes. And that's because the frame rate of the video camera and the turning of the wheel is such that the wheel turns this, let's say the wheel turns that much from one frame to the next, but then it turns, anyway, what you're catching is frames of the wheel, and that's why it looks like it's running backwards. The point is, my colleagues claimed, look, you can see the wagon wheel illusion in real life under continuous light, where if you stare at some, let's say you have a record player and you have this thing turning on it, you can actually see it running backwards once in a while. Anyway, my lab did studies on that and showed that their interpretation of that was actually not in support of discrete frames of perception. It's a long story. If we set up a mirror, so you're seeing the thing and the exact same thing in a mirror, they'll reverse at different times, which is not what would happen if you're taking snapshots. Long story short, we don't know. I don't see any really good reason at the moment to think that perception is discrete. But it does appear that other things like decision making may actually be discrete. Like every 40 milliseconds, the brain runs a simulation of should I turn right or left here, and then finally says, okay, I'm gonna turn right here or whatever. But you can actually see, at least in rats, that it seems to happen about every 40 milliseconds where you run a simulation, assess it, then you run another simulation and assess it. So other parts might be discrete. This is the weird thing about the brain is parts of it are analog and parts of it are discrete, and at different levels you might have both things going on. Yeah.
Okay, our friend Terry remembered her question, so I think. Okay, it's a different question. Last question.
So, David, we've known each other for what, like 7 years?
At least.
Yep. And thank you for representing some version of reality that's important to understand. And so my question is, what confuses you the most about reality at this point?
Oh, about reality?
Yes.
Jesus, it's this issue. Thank you for that. It's such a good question. And this is what led me to write this book, Windows on Reality. It's just this little amount we see. And as you know from hooking up an infrared camera, and as you know, there are cameras for all different parts of the spectrum and different ways to see things. And of course, supersonic hearing and anyway,
sorry, I'm going to challenge you a little more in terms of like personal experience. Not the scientific. I get you got that tracked, but like your actual experience, like you're a deeply embodied human being who also has knowledge about how things work, and you also have the question about questioning how things work. In addition to that, so. But like there's some part of you that I love that it's so alive and confused, and I kind of want to know what that is.
Yeah, got it. So you mean my experience of reality as opposed to, yeah, fine. You want the whole list of the top 10. Just as an example, every fucking night when I get into bed and I think, okay, now I'm going to stick my head in the night blender of dreams and have all these things that I take to be real, and I'll be scared and I'll be happy and I'll be thrilled and I'll wake up and I'll say, oh, I guess none of that was real, and now I'm back here. We don't have any explanation of what that's about even. So I think dreams is a big one. And just this issue, even when we were talking about, was this a simulation? There's this possibility that the simulation just began and you've got all these memories that are implanted in the simulation. So I think I grew up here and I went to this college and blah, blah, blah. And then, like, how the fuck do I know if that's real or not real? So yeah, there's really no end to the number of confusions. Yeah, and this is what drives the science.
Last night I had a dream where you and I were like laying in the same bed, and then that's so weird. It's so weird. And then you
that was no dream, Alex.
This is. And then you tapped me to let me know that something started wetting the side of my head, and I thought it was like a dog peeing on me or something. It was such a weird dream. It happened last night. What a weird simulation. What a great way to end the show.
All right, thank you guys so much for being here.
Thanks everybody for coming out. Huge thank you. I got some thoughts on the way out. So simulationseries.com is where you can find us. All this content's on YouTube and Facebook as well. We do a daily studio show featuring a lot of these brilliant thought leaders across different industries. Later this month, we are going to be hosting Naveen Jain. We are looking to also host Jason Silva at the end of this month. It's pending still, but it's exciting stuff for us. And then just keep checking in, keep looking in. David Eagleman's books are all available on Amazon. You can go to eagleman.com and find them as well. NeoSensory, also be really tuning into what he's building with that. And also, what is another important plug for you? Oh yeah, well, there's tons of important plugs. But anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. These events can't happen without you. Thank you, WorkWise, for hosting. Please stick around, network amongst your brilliant selves as well. And huge thank you for coming out tonight for this evening of intellectual.
Thank you guys. Thank you.